Good morning, afternoon, evening, night, whenever you're listening to this music appreciation class. This is Mr. Kimball here for your third lecture of the third 9 weeks, and this one is titled Music of the 19th and Early 20th Centuries, specifically in America. So we're talking about music from the 1800s and early 1900s. So jumping right in here, we're going to talk about the early pop songwriter Stephen Collins Foster. Stephen Collins Foster was born in 1826 and died in 1864, and he's regarded as the first important composer of American popular song. He produced around 200 songs during the 1840s, 1850s, and early 1860s, and he was probably most likely the first person in the United States to make his living as a full-time professional songwriter, surviving on the fees and royalties generated by sales of sheet music for some of his songs, his most popular songs like "Oh Susanna," "Old Folks at Home," "My Old Kentucky Home," "Good Night." My Old Kentucky Home, Good Night is what that should say. It's abbreviated as My Old Kentucky Home. Jeannie with the Light Brown Hair, and Beautiful Dreamer, which we'll get to listen to here in just a second. His biggest hit was a plantation song called Old Folks at Home, and it sold over 100,000 copies of sheet music in 1851, which was the year it was first published. On a per capita basis, this is equal to about a million seller in today's terms, so it was very, very popular. You got to remember the population was much lower in 1851. Foster's success was supported by a number of social and technological factors that are really important to note too. First, minstrel troupes, which we talked about minstrel shows in the last lecture. Minstrel troupes are the groups that perform minstrel shows. They performed his songs on their tours, and they popularized them across the country. In addition, the sheet music publishing business was really expanding during the mid-19th century, and that fueled a rapid growth of public music education, which is what you're doing right now, public music education. This allowed a lot more people to be able to read and play simple piano arrangements. So basically, public education with music comes into the schools, and a lot more people know how to read music. Well, since you know how to read music, you can perform simple piano arrangements. And then what people did was they purchased arrangements of these songs, and they were able to play them in their own homes. That was kind of the idea. The trend also, this public music education trend and performing these songs also sparked a big industry in making cheap pianos for the home. And the piano eventually became a pretty standard feature of middle class parlors. Which a parlor is a cozy room with sofas and paintings and books. It's kind of like where you would have guests sit and gather for a while. Think of it like the living room. It's kind of like the center of family life. So if you have grandparents or great grandparents. I mean, obviously, we probably don't have grandparents or great grandparents that were around in the mid 1800s, but nonetheless, their parents and their grandparents might have been, and that's why you might see some older folks have pianos in their home, or some more traditional folks have pianos in their home, because that was the epitome of class. Like you had money, you could afford a piano. You must have been cool if you had a nice piano in your house. So there's a little bit about that. Foster's success as a hitmaker occurred well before the rise of electronic mass media, which means recording. So Foster's music wasn't really being recorded all that much at the time. It was dependent on the ability of the public to read and perform the arrangements of songs published on sheet music. All Foster did was write the music down, and then people would perform them. So think about like now how we listen to our favorite songs on the radio or on our phones, on Spotify, whatever. That wasn't possible back then. People had to play them or go listen to somebody play them if they wanted to hear them. So it was really important that you were that somebody in your house was okay, at least an amateur level decency at playing the piano. So amateur piano playing was really regarded as a female specialization. So if you were a woman that knew how to play the piano fairly well in the mid 1800s, you were way up on the list of prospective wives. Like people wanted to marry you more if you could play a piano halfway decently. And really, the piano remained the center of domestic music making in the United States until about the 1920s, which is when the radio started to take off. So let's take a second and listen to a little bit of Beautiful Dreamer here. I think you're going to find some of these songs are really familiar. We're only going to listen to Beautiful Dreamer, but Oh Susanna is the other one that is super popular, especially in the South. So you probably have heard a few of these before. Here is Beautiful Dreamer. I apologize that my back screen is so bad. I'm going to mute the ad.
Has finally made an appearance. That face wouldn't be doing that if you weren't staying.
Here we go. So we're going to hear a pretty clear verse-chorus form here. You had the first verse there. This is the chorus now. And you'll hear we're going to go right back into the same theme, and they're going to start it with Beautiful Dreamer again. There it is. Okay, so you kind of get the idea with that one. Maybe you've heard that one before. Let's jump back to our presentation. That's it for Stephen Collins Foster, so let's move on to dance music and brass bands. So we've already kind of talked about the role of the European stream in bringing dance traditions to America. We're going to see this throughout the 1800s and 1900s, as we kind of foreshadowed last week. So American popular music has always been closely bound since its very inception to dance and social functions, like dancing for courtships, like think in more modern times, proms and homecoming dances and things like that. For dancing for entertainment, celebration of community, and ethnic and class identity. So we obviously talked a little bit about square dances and country dances and things like that. Now we're going to talk about balls, like the grand ball, and think like Cinderella, glass slipper, like this kind of dance, the ball. So the typical setting for dance among the upper classes was the ball, and it was organized around a program of pre-selected music played by an orchestra. Normally that pre-selected music included a waltz, a mazurka, or a polka, and a cotillion. So those were just the names of the different dances they had there. Normally they were associated with different times. So like the waltz was always in 3. It would go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and so on and so forth. The succession of dances was overseen by a dance master who called out the sequences of movements, so you might get like a little announcement. That's a big thing in square dancing, and you can kind of see it trickle down. Well, actually, it started with more formal dances, and then it kind of trickled down to those country dances. And it was very, very formal. So I wanted to read to you this rule for male dress published in a dance instruction book in 1867, just to give you some idea of the close relationship between ballroom dancing and formality. All right, so it says, the dress should be studiously neat, leaving no impression other than that of a well-dressed gentleman. Black dress coat, black or white vest, black trousers, white necktie, patent leather boots or pumps, and black or white stockings. White kid gloves, hair well-dressed. Coats of fancy character and colors, velvet colors, and metal buttons are not proper for the opera or ball. So you can get the idea of how formal and uptight this kind of was. So jumping away from the ball there for a moment, we're going to talk about brass bands and the brass band concert. The brass band concert was one of the most important musical aspects of American life, and although military bands made up of brass instruments had been around really since the birth of the United States, like the Revolutionary War, we had military bands. They spread rapidly around the end of the Civil War. So why would brass bands be so popular during and after the Civil War? Well, really what we have to think of here is just an estimate from the time. There was, at one point, the Union Army so we had the Union Army and the Confederate Army. The Union Army had about 500 bands and 9,000 players during the Civil War. These were military bands. 500 bands and 9,000 players. And not nearly as much. Most of the time, if you were in the Confederate Army, you were fighting, not playing an instrument. But the Confederate Army also had several bands, just not nearly that amount. So after the war ends, what are all these musicians going to do? Well, they're going to go find somewhere else to play. A number of these regimental bands continued to flourish after the war. Many musicians who were decommissioned formed bands in their home communities. So all of the people that were in the military kind of went to their homes and they formed bands there. Also, colleges and high schools formed bands during this period because it sort of sparked this brass band movement. By 1889, a journalist was reporting that there were over 10,000 brass bands in the United States. Almost every town of note had a park with a band shell in it, and bands were formed in association with city governments, schools, churches, and business enterprises. One person wrote in 1878, he said, "A town without its brass band is as much in need of sympathy as a church without a choir. The spirit of a place is recognized in its band." So this brass band movement sparked all of these bands throughout communities and colleges and schools. So if you ever think to yourself, why on earth do we have a marching band? Like, how did that ever come to be? What made people want to start dressing in funny-looking military-esque uniforms with fancy hats and playing weird instruments? Well, go back to the Civil War and the brass band movement shortly thereafter. That's where it came from. All of those people went to their homes, and this sparked a brass band movement. And now we have bands in schools, and it's kind of stuck around since then. The other reason we have bands in schools is because of the guy pictured here named John Philip Sousa, who lived from 1854 to 1932. John Philip Sousa, you're going to watch this video here in just a moment, and it'll tell you a little bit more about him. But he's popularly known as America's March King. He's the son of a trombonist in the U.S. Marine Band, who was in the U.S. Marine Band and became the conductor of the U.S. Marine Band. After doing that for quite a while, he formed a commercial concert band known as just the Sousa Band, and he composed a number of really popular marches like El Capitan, the Washington Post, and the Stars and Stripes Forever, which we're going to listen to here in just a second.
John Philip Sousa led the Marine Band to new heights of popularity during his tenure as leader from 1880 to 1892. It was during this era that he earned the title the March King, a well-deserved nickname that continues to this day. Of the 136 marches he composed, one has stood out above all the rest. It was composed in 1896 as Sousa sailed back home from a long European vacation. The inspiration for this march was born of a combination of homesickness, fond memories of his time as leader of the Marine Band, and his stirring recollection of the American flag flying over the White House. The resulting march became his best-known work, and in 1987, it officially became our national march, the Stars and Stripes Forever.
Okay, and maybe that sounds a bit familiar to you. Hopefully it does. Like I said, that's our national march. All right, and back to it here. Talking about now the birth of Tin Pan Alley. Tin Pan Alley was this collection of music publishing businesses that formed in the lower part of Manhattan on a stretch of street known as 28th Street. Um, New publishing firms were founded by mainly Jewish immigrants, and they came from Eastern Europe, and they set up offices in this section of Manhattan, and they created a dense hive of really small rooms with pianos where composers and this I guess you would call it a job. This job known as song pluggers produced and promoted popular songs. These were very quickly, these were probably one of our first instances. Stephen Collins Foster sort of did it, but we're talking about mass produced music here. Music produced in a matter of minutes. Composers would write this stuff down and then immediately try to sell it. So, Tin Pan Alley refers to the reason it's called Tin Pan Alley is because there were so many pianos here and so many people playing different songs in a variety of different keys with a variety of different tunings and different speeds and all that. There was this clanging sound of a bunch of pianos. Just imagine kind of like hundreds of people playing piano at the same time and it not sounding all that great. That's why they call it Tin Pan Alley. It kind of sounded like they were smashing against a tin pan. So popular songs were printed as sheet music and were promoted by song pluggers whose job it was to promote a given company's product. So a song plugger would go around to department stores where he or she would deliver a bundle of sheet music and would then sing the company's latest songs over and over and over to get customers' attentions that were shopping at that store. It would typically end, the day of a song plugger would typically end with a night at a saloon or a backstage theater where he would perform from the table if he was, at a saloon, or where he might try to convince a popular singer that was about to go take stage to plug in one of the company's songs. Sing this for me while you're on stage so that way we can sell more. People would hear these out in public. People would hear these walking down Tin Pan Alley. They say, man, that sounds really good. I want to go purchase that. And then they would go buy the sheet music from the publisher. So that's kind of how the music industry worked back then. This also sparked, it kind of worked hand in hand with this musical tradition known as vaudeville. Vaudeville was a popular theatrical form that descended from music hall shows and minstrel shows. And it became an important medium for popularizing Tin Pan Alley songs. So unlike minstrel shows, normally with a minstrel show, you'd have a bunch of people, like a cast of people, remain on stage for a whole performance, and there would be different parts of the performance that would kind of link together. It would tell one larger story, but there would be different acts in it. A vaudeville show consisted of singers, acrobats, comedians, jugglers, dancers, and it really didn't have any narrative theme. It didn't have animal handlers. It would just be a total variety of acts. In fact, it was a predecessor to like the television variety shows that were really popular in the 1950s and 1960s. So every city that was somewhat big, every city in the country had at least one large vaudeville theater, and the music publishing firms would send representatives to these theaters and sort of make a circuit of them, and they would go there and try to get the performers to plug their songs. And performers would be on certain contracts with the publishing companies to sing so many of their songs and do things like that. So out of these performers, we have Paul Dresser, who wrote a series of sentimental and nostalgic songs, including The Letter That Never Came and On the Banks of the Wabash Far Away. Pretty popular composer of the early Tin Pan Alley era. He wasn't a vaudeville performer, but he was a composer that would plug his music into vaudeville acts. He was alive from 1857 to 1906. Harry Von Tilzer was sometimes referred to as the daddy of popular song, and he was another successful composer and songwriter. He had hits like A Bird in a Gilded Cage, I Want a Girl Just Like That Girl That Married Dear Old Dad, and yeah, he was a pretty popular composer. And the last songwriter was James A. Bland, and he was the first successful black songwriter. He was an ex-minstrel show performer from a middle-class background and wrote about 700 songs, including Carry Me Back to Old Virginia, and that is the official state song of Virginia, and O Dem Golden Slippers. Which became really, really popular in Europe. So there is the Tin Pan Alley bit. I'm going to give you your first keyword of the day, and the first keyword is tin. That is Tin, tin. The first keyword is tin. Okay, and then we just have a couple more slides here to go. The next thing we're going to talk about is the ragtime craze. Ragtime refers to the African American term to rag, which means to enliven a piece of music by shifting melodic accents to offbeats. Shifting accents to the offbeat should remind you of something that we talked about last week, and that something is syncopation. That is, to rag is the same thing as to syncopate. They literally mean the same thing. Syncopation was an African musical tradition that was sort of brought over to America, so we can sort of see this in our first musical genre, a really strong African tradition here in ragtime. So ragtime music emerged in the 1880s, and its popularity peaked in the 1890s and early 1900s. Some regard ragtime as a descendant of minstrelsy because white musicians simplified elements of African American musical styles to spice up their own performances. A lot of white musicians would perform ragtime, so some sort of regard it as that. It's really impossible to pinpoint the precise origins of ragtime. It's got some strong African traditions, but it's really kind of impossible to specifically pinpoint where it came from. One thing that we will note is that it's been suggested that banjo playing and the patterns of banjo playing and more like the West African tradition of banjo playing and the slaves in the South and all that sort of sparked ragtime. Ragtime sounds like if you were playing banjo music on the piano, so something kind of cool there. One of the most influential ragtime composers was Scott Joplin. He's probably the best known composer of ragtime music, and he was an African-American pianist that was born in Texas in 1868. Scott Joplin's first successful piece was Maple Leaf Rag, which is named after the Maple Leaf Social Club in Sedalia, where he was often playing. The piece was published in 1899, became a huge hit, and spread Joplin's fame all over the world, outside of America even. So that was, in addition to all that, Maple Leaf Rag really sparked the ragtime craze, being put out in 1898. I know I said 1890s were when it was popular, but it really didn't. It got really popular in the early 1900s, thanks to Maple Leaf Rag. Everybody loved it. I was going to play Maple Leaf Rag for you, but I decided The Entertainer might be just a little bit better for this. So we're going to go with The Entertainer because I'm sure you probably have heard this before. So let's listen to just a bit of The Entertainer by Scott Joplin. So we're going to have an ad first. Guess I'll just, look, I can skip it. Okay, here you go. Alright, there you go. There's a little bit of The Entertainer. Really important here. One of the questions on your quiz is going to ask you what was the first successful piece of music by Scott Joplin. It's important that you don't get this confused. We just listened to The Entertainer. That is one of his most popular pieces, but it was not the first popular piece by Scott Joplin. The first popular piece was the Maple Leaf Rag. So make sure you choose that one on the quiz. Last slide here, and we'll get you done really quick. I apologize, this was kind of a long one, but a lot of really cool information to get out to you. The phonograph is important to the rise of American popular music because it was the first example of recording music. The phonograph was invented in 1877 by Thomas Alva Edison. That should sound like a really familiar name to you. Coincidentally, this guy in France named Charles Cross also invented it at around the same time. I'm going to credit it to Thomas Edison just because American made it. We'll give it to him for now. But also know that it was being invented at the same time by somebody over in France. The idea behind a phonograph is that it would transform the energy of sound waves into physical impressions on a foil or wax-coated cylinder, and that could then be used to reproduce the original sounds that were recorded. In 1887, Emil Berliner developed the flat gramophone disc, which was more durable and cheaper to produce than the wax cylinders that were with the original phonograph. So Thomas Edison's required wax cylinders. This one was a more like a disc. In the 1890s, the first Nickelodeons, which is pretty cool, like, yeah, Nickelodeon, yeah, you probably sounds familiar. A Nickelodeon is a machine that plays the latest hits for a nickel. So think about a machine that would play music for coins that were normally set up in public places. You're probably thinking of a jukebox. This is the later name for Nickelodeon. So first were Nickelodeons, and then they changed the name to jukeboxes later on in the 20th century. By the turn of the century, the American market in phonograph disc was firmly dominated by two big companies: Columbia Records, which was formed in 1887, and the Victor Talking Machine Company, better known now as just Victor, which was formed in 1901. In 1902, the 12-inch shellac disc was introduced, and it was played at a standard rate of 78 revolutions per minute, or RPM. These discs could hold about 4 minutes of music. In 1904, a double-sided disc was introduced, and this was the standard type of record issued for sale in the United States until 33 1/3 rotation per minute long playing discs and 45 rotation per minute singles were introduced in the late 1940s. So this was like the first example of records. It really came along quickly. The first phonographs, important to know, they did not sound good. They were mainly used as toys, and they were used to like record like your mom saying hello, or like if the president was speaking, they might record it on a phonograph disc. They did not sound good. They sounded very, 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 very bad. I can't stress that enough. And yeah, guys, that's about it. I did want to talk about this last concept here, a little philosophical talk for you, and then I'll let you go. The process of mechanical recording introduced, and that mechanical recording means just to record music. It introduced this process known as schizophonia. Not schizophrenia, schizophonia. And schizophonia means the splitting of sounds from their original sources. So just an interesting perspective here for you. Sound recording introduces a gap between original context and meaning of music. We're taking the music that was created in the halls and in the homes and all that, and we're putting it on a disc, or we're putting it on a wax cylinder, whatever way you want to put it on. It takes away that connection to community life and individual identity, and it's just purely sound now. There's no culture associated with it. It's just sound. And it's a purely acoustic phenomenon. It's just something we hear. And we can reproduce it and consume it anytime we want, especially now. I think about it now. We can get on our phones, get on Spotify, YouTube, and listen to any song we want to, just right then and there. Some critics of that say this dehumanizes music. We're taking the human part of music out and just making it something that we do in passing. I'd like to kind of know your thoughts on that. Just think about that for a second. Are we dehumanizing music by taking it out of the context from which it's created? People don't really go to concert halls anymore. I'd love for them to, but the fact of the matter is that they don't. It's just not a thing. Like I said, I love going to concerts, and people go to live concerts, I guess, of their favorite bands, but for the most part, the way we consume music is by listening to it as a recording. Others, though, have argued that this is a really good thing because the split lets us get music to millions of people, both in America and around the world. People that live in New York City can listen to the rural music of Southern Alabama because we can record that music and send it to them. They can access it. People that live in Europe can hear their favorite American music artist because we record it. That wasn't something that was really possible before recording. So some interesting debates there, some good, some bad, but just think about that for a second. And that is going to end our lecture for today. Like I said, I apologize, this one was a long one, but I think it was pretty interesting. I hope you guys enjoyed it. The second key word for this week's lecture is pan. The second key word for this week's lecture is pan, and that's P-A-N, pan. All right, guys, take care. Make sure to take that quiz and let me know if you have any questions. Bye-bye.